So if you're joining us and you can see on the screen, go ahead. If you type in that tiny URL in yellow, it'll give you access to our presentation. If you can't get it, let us know in the chat. It'll help us. We're trying to figure it out as we go along. We should have, I think everyone's here. Let me take attendance real quick. We're just waiting for a couple more people. All right, I think we're only missing one person. The last couple of people started. I was gonna say, do you guys want to go ahead? All right, let me, while I'm unmuted, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Alice Baldecki, and I'll let Jessica and Laurel introduce themselves. A lot of a lot of your names on here sound familiar, or you're in our department and are in our hallway somewhere. So hi guys. We are, for the 2 hours, going to go ahead and do an introduction to storylines. This is my 4th year in the district. The last years I've been teaching biology and physical science. I'm get to add physics back, but before I was here in Zumwalt, I've taught at a couple of different schools. So overall, this is year 11 for me. So you'll hear me talk in a little bit, but I'll let everyone else introduce themselves before we get going.
Go ahead, Jessica.
Hi, I'm Jessica, and I have been teaching in the district. I guess this is year 6, but minus last year because I was on a leave. So I'm really excited to be back. Overall, this is year 10, I think. That's really crazy to think about. So I teach zoology, physical science, and biology. I did implement storylines 2 years ago. Laurel and I kind of started it. We asked Anne if we could kind of try it out with some of our students, and then COVID happened, so then it was really crazy. And then last year, several more teachers decided to try it out. So we're not going to claim to be experts on this, but I think that hopefully this will be informative. While I've been on leave, I've actually been working on my master's in curriculum and instruction. So learning some of those about, different learning theories and some of the assignments I've had to do has really helped me put storylines into a bit more a better perspective, and like, wow, this is really a good way to teach students. So that's kind of the background that I'm going to bring today, since I wasn't here last year actually doing the storylines.
All right, and I'm Laurel Taylor. This is my 6th year in the district as well, my 8th year overall. We did storylines, like Jessica mentioned, 2 years ago. Last year, I still don't feel like we got like a full year's worth of storylines in, so I'm really looking forward to this year. Hopefully we can fully implement everything that we want to and be able to use storylines like it's intended. So hopefully we'll be able to, use all the knowledge that we're giving you today in our own classroom, because I don't feel like we've been able to do that just yet. I teach physical science and biology, as well as the Project Lead the Way medical interventions class. So biology has turned into my favorite. It was always my favorite topic, but now with the storylines, I just love the style of the class and can't wait to do it again this year. If you haven't clicked or typed in this link into your browser, you'll be able to open up this presentation if you type in this tiny URL on your own. There are some links in there that you can click on throughout the presentation, so it is helpful for you to be able to have that open on your screen as well if you're interested. We'll probably, Alice, do you mind like typing that into the chat or something too, that people can have that available to them even after we move on? All right. If we can just start by having people fill out this quick survey for us, we just kind of want to get an idea of your familiarity with the storylines in NGSS. It's just a couple questions. It'll take you no time at all, but we would appreciate the feedback. So if you don't mind, Alice, just put that link into the chat to open up the presentation, and you're able to click on that link to fill out the survey for us. Everyone, just a little bit of time here.
While you're doing that survey, at any point, if you have any questions or anything like that, since there are 3 of us, I'm hoping one of us can be able to answer your questions in the chat. We're getting used to it, so we're hoping we'll be able to get back to you as soon as you put it in there. But if not, just you can always send us a message as well, and we can go ahead and answer that.
like we got most people here. Thanks for the information. It looks like some people here probably know more than we do even. So if anyone wants to chime in along the way and add anything in there, I know you can't really unmute yourselves, but feel free to add some things into the chat if you have anything to add. We by no means are experts. We are just sharing what we know so far and the little bit of research that we've been able to do and what works in our classroom. But by all means, please feel free to jump in at any point. Looks like some people are certainly more comfortable than others, so hopefully we'll get everyone at least on a basic understanding or a little bit more familiarity with what storylines and NGSS can do for you. So let's go ahead and let Jessica give us a good introduction. She's been doing a lot of great research for us. So.
All right, so I'm just going to give like kind of a quick overview of what next generation science standards are. So I will say that like Laurel said, I'm not claiming to be an expert. I wouldn't say that I really knew much about them until recently, having to do research and get some information about them for some of the assignments that I've had to do for my master's. So basically they were written to help students show their knowledge rather than just memorize some facts and regurgitate them on a test. So it was developed by the National Research Council, and they kind of developed a framework known as three-dimensional learning. So I'll talk about that a little bit. So if you implement these different dimensions within your teaching, it can help the kids focus on concepts and gain a better depth of knowledge over breadth of knowledge. So again, really learning, like actually learning, not just memorizing, which is what I think most of our students do. I think that's how we were kind of taught. Maybe that's how we were kind of taught to teach, like, here's a vocab, memorize these words. Okay, here's a vocab test. And, you know, it's really difficult for students to really understand what those words mean if they're not able to like apply them. So the next generation standards kind of build a framework for you to be better able to make or implement lessons where they're applying and getting the information reiterated over different years and even within the same year. So you don't want to just talk about one topic one time and then move on to the next and never mention it again. So that's where the storylines come in, and we'll get there a little later. So the three dimensions that Next Generation Science has set out are the SEPs, which stand for Science and Engineering Practices, Cross-Cutting Concepts, the CCCs, and the DCIs, which are Disciplinary Core Ideas. So in theory, this works best if you're implementing all of them. So I'm going to show you, there's a list on the next slide. Who's got the slides? Oh, thank you. Okay, so the first box is showing the 8 science and engineering practices. So these are like kind of the main practices that you, or that all teachers through K through 12 should be able to focus on in any science class. It's not like, oh, these are only for biology, these are only for physical science. So we want students to be able to ask questions, define problems. We want them to be able to develop and use models to help them understand or learn about something. We want them to be able to carry out an investigation and, you know, developing and carrying that out. And we want them to be able to like design, like they're so bad at just even following a lab that you give them. And then they don't understand why they're doing that. They're just like following a recipe. So again, NGSS, these science and engineering practices help them create or learn why they need to be doing what they're doing, help them do it, and then learn from that. So I'll let you guys look over those. And then there are 7 cross-cutting concepts. So again, these are supposed to be K through 12. It's not like, oh, we're only going to learn patterns in kindergarten. We're only going to learn cause and effect in 5th grade. And, you know, these are things that all teachers should be using in any science and any grade. And then the disciplinary core ideas. So it's broken down into 4 disciplines. So we still have physical science, life science, earth and space, and engineering, technology, and applications of science. So we'll get into the storylines actually don't cover, I think, the earth and space very much, those standards that are in the Missouri Learning Standards. So that's something we're still working on, but I'm hoping that you can see like when you look at like patterns. So if we look at the cross-cutting concept of patterns, can you think of a pattern you see when you talk about matter with your students? Okay, so think about that. And then, but do you also see cause and effect when you talk about matter? Like, so we can talk about, how, the states of matter. So if you're heating up a substance, that matter is, the effect is that it's going to gain energy, right? Okay, so, but you can also see that when you look at like ecosystems. So when you're looking at ecology or something, do you see a pattern when you look at that strand or learning our disciplinary core idea? But you can also see cause and effect. Oh, if we take away the producers, then, there's not going to be any consumers left, and so on and so on. So they're just different elements, again, that you should be able to implement in any grade and in any discipline in science. And once students get the hang of that, they'll be able to use those on their own. Like, oh, hey, I see a pattern here. Oh yeah, that's cause and effect. Oh, that's stability and change. So once you teach them and they've, had practice with them, the idea is that they will be able to then see these on their own. And then in the future, when they are either working in a science field or not working in a science field, they are science literate individuals that, can make science informed decisions without necessarily being in a science class, which I think some people might like. So, all right, I'm ready for the next slide. All right, so the challenge, there are lots of challenges to this. So I will say, like, I was kind of hesitant to get on board with storylines. I do know, I can't remember what school district it was, or sorry, not school district, which school it was. They referred to it as spiraling. Maybe it was either West or North, I think. But when that was first brought to me, it was my first or second year here. And I thought, oh my gosh, how in the heck does that even work? Like, that makes no sense. No, we're going to teach genetics and we're only going to talk about genetics, and then we're going to be done with genetics and we're going to move on to ecology or whatever. But now, again, after implementing it and learning more about the next generation science standards, I really do see the benefits of spiraling or kind of clumping or grouping different concepts together to help students make better connections. So the challenge is this is not how we were taught in science. I was taught, you learn about genetics, you take your test, you move on to the next topic. You don't really go back and talk about genetics ever again. So I think that can be also frustrating as a student, like, well, why am I learning this? So this hopefully is going to help students see why it is important to learn these concepts, not just, oh, I'm just here in biology, this is what I have to do. And it's not how we were taught. I know none of my education courses talked about teaching science this way. So if you are a new teacher, maybe you have some insight on that. I don't know what type of educational classes, or if they're talking about NGSS or not. So if you would like to say in the chat, that might be helpful. I can pick your brain a little bit. So in order for this to be effective, all three dimensions are supposed to be integrated into each standard. So this is a challenge because it is a lot. Like, you yourself, need to become educated on the science and engineering practices, the cross-cutting concepts, the DCIs. And currently there are not any published materials that are 100% aligned to the next generation science standards. So I think I remember when we got our biology textbook, I think it says that it's aligned or that it's somewhat aligned, but it's some research that I've been doing for my master's course. It's just been very difficult to align these standards to a curriculum because it has a lot to do with how the teacher's teaching. So it's not necessarily like I'm going to put this textbook in front of you and it's going to be there. So this is where the storylines also come in. So they're not published, I don't think, right? Okay, I don't think they're published. So once they are, or what we're doing is kind of helping them test it out, I guess. So maybe it can someday be published. But so this is again where the storylines come in, because no textbook is going to be able to teach the 3-dimension or integrate the 3 dimensions like the storyline has. The other problem is our standards. So we use the Missouri Learning Standards. We don't use Next Generation Science Standards. However, they have modified it using the Next Generation Science Standards. So I've linked those so that you can, if you wanted to click on those to compare. I'm going to pull up the Missouri Learning Standard, or I guess I can't show my screen. Yes, can you pull that up? Thank you.
If at any point anyone's having a hard time with the links, really quick while we're getting that pulled up, just shoot us a message over in the chat and I can go ahead and re-put the link in for you. So,
okay, Rachel said that they do talk about NGSS. So I'm curious to know what they are actually talking about. Maybe we can, I guess we can't bring somebody on. Is that not a thing? Okay, not to like call you out, Rachel. We'll talk later then. Well, I'm glad to hear that they are actually talking about it. Hopefully that it is useful. All right, so the Missouri Learning Standards, I kind of looked it over and it looks like the disciplinary core ideas are the core descriptions. So column G. And I mean, I think this is kind of loose. So, and then the disciplines are the strand. And then the SEPs and the CCCs are within the MLS description. So the column K. So this is where it gets kind of confusing because it's not explicit. Like they don't make it clear that this is the SEP or what is the CCC. So if you read through those, like you'll see make observations. So sometimes they're explicit, so that is a cross-cutting concept, or sorry, a science and engineering practice, or what is it? You know, plan and conduct an investigation. So I can't remember his name. We had PD last year. Anderson.
Yeah.
He made cards. They align to the NGSS. So if you could click on that link for me. Oh, I think it's the next slide. Sorry, this is strange to go with somebody else. Yeah, the wonder of science. And then if you could click on the high school NGSS performance expectations, I think that's what it was. Yes. Okay. So this one makes it a little bit more clear. So he's highlighted what is the SEP and what is the cross-cutting concept. So that way that is more clear. The storylines also make it really clear in the teacher narrative what the SEPs are and what the cross-cutting concepts are. So that is very helpful. Okay, so if you want, you can look at those. And then if we could go back to the other slide, I'm sorry. And then, so the Jason Cran, who is the kind of head over the storylines, aligned the storyline for us in the MLS storyline alignment. So if you could click that link. So you'll see in a minute when you do storylines, it's not like we're talking about genetics, we're talking about DNA in like each unit. So across the top, you see Africa, homeostasis, melanin disease, penguin, canine. So those initials are down the right-hand side, and those are, it states what standard is in each of those units. So you'll see that most of them have at least, are mentioned at least in 2 different units, some of them more. And then you'll see at the end, the red, unfortunately, the storyline does not cover the Earth and space standards that Missouri has asked us to include in our teaching. So we are in the process of trying to figure out how to incorporate those and make sure we meet those, since those essentially could be on the end of course exam that is given by Missouri. All right, do you guys have questions so far? I feel like I'm talking pretty fast. Wait a minute, if you wait for some people to type if they have questions where we're at.
Tracy had mentioned us. I think she just sent it straight to us that she loves Paul Anderson.
Okay.
I don't know how many people weren't able to attend last April, but if you haven't had a chance to check out Paul Anderson stuff on The Wonder of Science, we'll mention him a couple of times. He does a great job. He's fantastic. We were so excited to attend his PD. If you have any questions, we can, like we've all said, we're not professionals, but we can definitely give you our takeaways at any point.
I also see Rachel said that they promote the next generation science standards in the 5E learning model, which maybe that was something I learned long ago in my educational courses. I don't remember, but I do know for a fact that I did have to relearn it when in a course that I've taken for my master's. So I am familiar with that. And I think I actually did a PowerPoint presentation on implementing storylines with the 5E model. So that makes sense that they promote that. All right, I guess we are good. All right, so just some strategies to help you implement cross-cutting concepts, SEPs. So from what I have found, it is most beneficial to explicitly teach the cross-cutting concepts and SEPs. Like, don't just say, hey, what is a cross-cutting? Here's a list of cross-cutting concepts. What do you think? Like, so what I found is that it is best to do a lesson and pick 2 or 3 cross-cutting concepts that were in that lesson and point them out to students and specifically talk about what those cross-cutting concepts and SEPs are and what they mean. And then again, like with the next lesson, maybe incorporate ones that you've already talked about and add one in. And then as you go, then by the end of the year, they are more familiar and have had examples where they have applied all of those cross-cutting concepts and SEPs. So they're used to help make connections. And so graphic organizers are really good to use. You can use exit tickets, and then also like devoting a space in your classroom to where students can reference them. So like I've put posters up there. I don't know if you can see. I don't know how big you can see me on your screen, but there's posters of the EPs and the cross-cutting concepts above my board. I tried to print them out big enough so that students could reference them, but I'm sure I'll have to print stuff out for them to have too. So because they're in every science discipline and they are in every grade, they shouldn't be difficult for you to find them within a lesson. Like they might already even be in the lessons that you're teaching without storylines. It just may not be as evident as you're teaching. Like you have to kind of like look for them, or like, oh yeah, like I see patterns in this lesson, or I see cause and effect here. So that's one good thing about the storylines, is that if you could click on the calendar for me. So each unit has a calendar, and right down at the bottom, so you can see the highlighted areas, it tells you what CCC they're using, what learning standard, and what, I think the SP is that a SEP? Is that the SEP, I guess? Or now I'm confused why that just says SP, not SEP. But for reference, you have the cross-cutting concepts right there in green. So you can see they're focusing on cause and effect in the first few lessons. They've added patterns. So you can probably see more than cause and effect, more than just patterns. But again, you don't want to overwhelm them with, oh, what's every single cross-cutting concept that you see? So this is kind of a way to introduce it to them. So I think that the storylines do a good job of that. So, you know, when you're implementing storylines, you can say, oh yeah, I see that, you know, these are the main ones being used. These are the ones I'm going to focus on for the first unit. And there's also a teacher narrative, and it lists them up at the top. Oh, there's the SEP. So SEP1. So I guess there must be a form somewhere. I don't know if there. I guess I should have looked into that. I apologize for not being prepared about that. But the storylines are great because they kind of do like the hard work of finding out what science and engineering practice and cross-cutting concepts that you need. And then lastly, this was on the last slide, I apologize. So if you could go back one slide, if we were using the next generation science standard, so if you could click on that middle link and scroll down, so you can search the standard by grades, but if you just click on any one of those, Laurel, I know these aren't our standards, but they break it down for you as well. So you can see they give you the performance expectation at the top, and then they state, okay, here's your science and engineering practice, your disciplinary core idea and cross-cutting concept that you can use to help you, the students, to meet that learning or that performance strand or the standard. And that is all I have. I feel like I was rambling, so I apologize. So if you do have questions or you need more clarification, if you want to type into the chat. And if not, then we'll move on to what is a storyline actually is. Are we good?
All right, so Jessica mentioned a lot of the background with NGSS, and they're certainly related to the storylines, but storylines aren't specifically an NGSS type of like standard. It's not part of the three-dimensional learning. Storyline just allows you to implement the NGSS, I think, in a little bit more obvious way. So these are just some documents that were provided for us by the Illinois Teaching Association. The storylines that we've been using are created specifically by this Illinois teaching group. And so storylining isn't specific to this one thing. It's a method that anyone can use. But when we talk about storylines, we're specifically talking about these Illinois ones that were provided for us. So if you're struggling with explaining to parents about why you should be using storylines, they do actually have a whole presentation that you can show parents. This was created directly by those Illinois science teachers. But I think this one single page does a pretty good job of explaining, like, why is it beneficial? What is it allowing us to do differently? So if you just need like a quick little handout or something like that for back to school night, if anyone's questioning kind of, if you're questioning even like, why should we be doing this? I think this document does a pretty good job of explaining some of those main ideas. So in general, what we're trying to get here is students to be like self-directed. We're trying to basically, like Jessica mentioned, not just teach them to memorize facts, but to actually think scientifically and be able to apply those skills basically across their life. It doesn't just have to be in a science classroom. They're going to use those critical thinking skills, certainly as they get a job and move on or go to college for even an unrelated science field. It is a method of teaching. So in this case, we do have a pretty nicely laid out curriculum for us. But as I mentioned before, it doesn't have to be just these storylines. Anyone can use storylines. I would really like to start implementing it in our physical science class. We've seen how well it works with our biology students. So that's something that I'm hoping to work towards. And one thing that I think is one of the harder shifts for a lot of teachers is that we're not really doing a whole lot of direct instruction. There's essentially no real lectures. Students are much more active in their learning process. They're going through activities. We're certainly there to support them, but it's much more student driven than what we would probably consider a traditional classroom. So just a quick brief overview of what a storyline is in general. And basically moving forward, we're just going to talk specifically about those Illinois storylines.
So again, it's going to seem weird and it will be challenging. And I guess I want to reiterate that because when we were doing this, you know, the first time, or I'm sure even last year, I think Laurel said, it's just like, is this even working? Like, are the kids actually learning? And they complain about it sometimes because they want the notes. but they also complain about when we give notes. So I do think that it does help them to learn. Like if you're doing something and you're hands on, it's going to be more effective than me standing in front of the room and saying, copy down what's on this board. So I don't know. I just feel that I need to reiterate that because I know that it can be like frustrating. Like, am I doing this? So why am I doing this? But I think it really is better for the students.
I agree. Taylor just sent me a message saying that, and she reminded me too, because I think Laurel and I might have been at that virtual PD where the Illinois group said, hey, we're going to start working on a working group for chemistry and physical science. I am completely not knowledgeable on how long it took them to write the biology storylines. I'm sure it took them several years, but I know that the physical science and the chemistry are in works. I don't have an update on when that is, but I did email him and I said, please put me on that mailing list for when it's available, because I know physical science would be really great. So Jessica did a great job talking about NGSS and everything, all the different components in three-dimensional learning. So what does that actually look like for a whole year? Laura, could you click on that first link for me? Sorry. So the Illinois Working Group has created a Grandmaster Overview calendar. It's not, like we've said, it's not traditional, hey, we're going to focus on this theme and topic and then move on. It's all very interwoven and integrated with itself. The curriculum of storylines is developed into 7 different groups, right? 7? How many? It's like, Jessica, I see what you mean. It's weird having someone else control your screen. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, sorry. And so they each have main driving questions that are listed in that darker color. The year does start off with the Africa storyline and finishes with dogs and canines. And the kids think it's weird at the beginning of the year. They're like, what are we going to talk about first? And I'm like, lions. And they're like, what are you talking about? And so we don't necessarily make this calendar available to the students. We kind of leave them a little bit in suspense. Some of the documents that we are going to be sharing with you are, some of them are student friendly. Some of them we're like, please don't share that. And so we'll let you know which ones are, yes, push out to your students, or yes, hey, keep that to yourself. Just because we don't want a whole bunch of the material becoming available out on the internet. So each unit, I guess we could call it, or your storyline, has driving questions. These are the questions that ultimately you want your students to take away, and they are directly related to the MLS alignment. If you zoom in, well, you don't have to, but everyone has access to it. Listed next to each one of the thematic questions or the phenomena-driven questions, it does have that standard, so you can see where it's tying it into. On the PowerPoint is also the MLS alignment link that's also there if you didn't save it from before. But underneath each driving question is kind of a mini unit. It's not necessarily a lesson, and we'll talk more about what that actually means later. But it kind of breaks it down into smaller categories or smaller units inside the big unit on what you're going to focus on. I want to say more often than not, after the end of each driving question, we had some sort of assessment. And we'll talk about assessments. They're not what you normally think they are. I think I really enjoyed them personally as an educator, because it forced me to make the kids think about the information in a different way, and it really enhanced their critical thinking skills. I will tell you, if you are thinking about implementing storylines, the Africa storyline is by far the longest. We actually ended up breaking it into 2 separate units. The first half of the Africa storyline is lions, and the second half is elephants. There is a great transition of a couple of different days where it makes the transitions comparing lions and elephants, and we'll get there if you stay around for the second half from 10 to noon. But it was just easier for us to go ahead and give a summative assessment in between those 2, because it also fell along with the quarter breaking up, but I know we don't have quarters now, so we're still a work in progress, and we'll have to figure that out ourselves. We made it through homeostasis about 80% before the semester came to an end. We felt really comfortable going ahead and putting majority of the homeostasis unit on and all of the Africa storyline on our semester final. We had, I think, like maybe a week or two that carried over into the second semester. Our melanin storyline took probably about a month. Got it pulled up on my other thing too. Disease, I want to say, took about a month as well. And then it got kind of tricky with EOC, spring break, wrapping up studying for finals. So we definitely cut down the penguin and dog storyline unit a lot. But as Jessica has mentioned, a lot of these standards are repeated by throughout all of the different storylines. So we tried just doing the activities that were really entertaining and more hands-on, or as much hands-on as we could be last year for student engagement. So Laurel, if you wouldn't mind going to day-to-day. So some of you are probably like, what does this actually look like? We were, as we all know, in a very interesting situation last year with COVID and not being able to really get kids in groups. My biggest suggestion is if you can get students to work in pods or small groups, it's going to be really helpful. A lot of these activities, I guess, can be done on paper, or we've tried to adapt to digital. Rockwood School District was all virtual last year. And so we connected with them and they did like a fantastic job. And so we actually took some of their things and modified it to make it work for us. So if you could click on the K-Cal hunting. This is one of the very first activities that we do as Life as a Hunter. And so normally you could be doing this as a hands-on. You could cut out all of these things and have them as paper. And if you wanted them to last a while, go ahead and laminate. But if you go down to the next one, there is individual groups. So each group has a different slide, and then they have little money values based off of the amount of kilocalories that each animal needs to go ahead and survive. There is the hunter prey aspect, and then we also talk about the nutrition aspect in terms of what they need to go ahead and survive. So each group could manipulate those little dollar bills into the circle of how much they need to go ahead and use to hunt. Or like I said, if you had them in pods, you could give each student like, hey, you're going to be the lion, or and you can have them move around and actually put it into a pot, into a central pot in the center. I was going to say Laurel's going to demonstrate, I think, or someone else is. But yeah, they're very user friendly. You can go ahead, move, drag around. And anytime you see anything that you would like, just go ahead and make yourself a copy. And like you can come down here. Group 5 is a brand new, fresh restart. And it'll say you can just go ahead and drag them in to the essential pot, and then that kilocalorie has been used. If you go to the next activity, Laurel. Oh, Ashley, is there a link to the slides that you're looking at now? I can't find it. So on our original storyline, the one that we sent out on the tiny URL, anything that's the blue underlined on the, if you make yourself a copy and have that open and click on those links, we have those all linked for you to go ahead and open and make yourself a copy. Some of them will automatically make you a copy. Others will go ahead and you have viewing permissions only, so you can go ahead and do a save as. I hope that helps. So protein modeling was one of the ones that were like, how do we do this? It took us a headache to try and go ahead and figure out. So during the melanin unit or storyline, we look at the amounts of melanin and what makes albinism such a unique genetic arrangement. And so we do go through and have the kids look for codons and look for the different mutations to go ahead and identify. I will say this information here that's right in front of you on your screen, along with all of the other information, is factual, scientific-based research done. It is pulled from actual research that scientists are currently doing when they do like the lions and elephants and sea otters at the very beginning. Those projects are still happening in some points, and so we like to go ahead and get the update to see where all these different animals are, and the kids will come back at the end of the year and look at it. So for this gene sheet, you have the original DNA strand, you have mutation 1, mutation 2, mutation 3. And the kids have to go ahead and identify what type of mutation it is. This is obviously completed because we had it done digitally and they went through and highlighted. You could easily print this blank one and have them go through and do a highlighting method if you would like. Laurel, if you go down to the next one. This is where it gets a little tricky. So around the outside, around the perimeter, are the different sequencings of each different amino acid. And so the arrows show how they all connect. It's a little tricky to see how it looks on a PowerPoint, but at the same time, it's also really tricky if you wanted to prep on paper, because you would have to go, if you wanted to, you could have the kids all cut them out, or you could have them cut out ahead of time, and then you could piece them together on a piece of paper. And obviously, if you did it paper-wise, you could make it 3-dimensional, which would be really cool to see all the protein folding. But either way, it's kind of a lot to look at. So those are different options that you can have for paper versus digital. I didn't link the DNA building or geographic mapping. I think those are pretty easy, and the geographic mapping we're actually going to talk about in our second session. So I'm going to leave you in suspense there. Things that we do print, and we, even though our kids were virtual, or we did a lot of them digitally, we did still print some things because at one point, we talk about digestive practices between herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores in terms of their digestive tract, and we look at their small, and large intestines. There is a direct correlation between their GI tracts and the type of diet that they eat, and so the students in one of those, we don't tell them, hey, if you're an herbivore, your intestinal tract is going to be this long, or if you're a carnivore, it's going to be this long. That's where they get to do. And so with this, we'll actually go ahead and print out these cards for them and cut them. There's a ton of different ones. Some are much harder than others. This is a great way to go ahead and differentiate between your students, because if you have students that you know are just a little bit slower on gaining concepts, you might want to give them an easier intestines versus your high flyers. Give them a long one. It'll take them forever. But well, like that, the dolphin, it takes or porpoise, I can't remember which one it is, but it's very long. And so we would go ahead and cut out these and give them a piece of string as well. And so they would actually use the string to mimic the pattern of the small intestines, and then take their string on however long it is and go ahead and measure it with their meter sticks. From there, there's actually, Laurel, if you go back to, I think it's tables. So things that we're planning to keep on digital would be the table that goes along with this. So it was definitely a hands-on and a computer activated couple of days. So the students would then go ahead and record all of the lengths of their small intestine, the hindgut, and the cecum if it was present. We talk about what those things are. And based off of that, we can go ahead and look at all of the animal data, because you would share them around. And the kids can go ahead and start looking for different patterns based off of what it is. You can see down at the bottom, I had 4 different classes last year doing that. And so you can share the whole spreadsheet with all of your classes if you would like. There's also a way just to share just that tab to your class, so they can't mess up anyone else's. But it was a great way to go ahead and project that up on the PowerPoint, and the kids would, once they had it all measured out, they would come back and tell me, or they would just raise their hand and I would go ahead and type it in. And that way the kids had access to that when we went through and did our analyzing questions. So I think we're definitely going to keep the tables digital. The other one is graphs. So this is from at the very beginning of the year. So it does have some instructions put in there, but the graph is not put in. I gave you one where the graph is already put in, but we'll go ahead and give the kids a set of data for future classes for chemistry and physics. They do put a strong emphasis on being able to digitally make graphs, so that way they have them for their lab reports, or if your kids are going into any of the AP classes eventually, they're going to need to be able to do it digitally as well. So there are certain times that data sets we either made or we found them where they were already put into a Google sheet. And so we walked through and taught our kids how to do these graphs. I generally teach general biology at the college prep or the co-taught classes. And I can tell you by the end of the year, all of my CT kids, regardless of whatever their accommodations were able to go ahead and make a graph on Excel without any help. So it's definitely a life skill, and they're like, yeah, I can just do it. I'm like, all right, here's a data set, make it. And they were able to go ahead and produce it in 5-10 minutes. So it's definitely those sort of skills that we want them to still be available to. Any questions? Go ahead, type them in. Give Laurel a minute. All right. If you think of something, send it in the chat and one of us will respond.
So the general format for these storylines, every unit or storyline kind of starts the same way with some sort of phenomenon, which Alice will talk about in a little bit more detail coming up, and a technique called QFT, or question formulation technique, which we'll also go into more detail. So every unit starts kind of with this grounding event. Usually it's a video that we watch, but it can be a picture, it can be a diagram. Ours typically for these storylines happen to be videos. After we get through that initial questioning session, students will go through a series of activities. Like I mentioned before, there's really not a whole lot of lecture-based direct instruction. There also aren't as many hands-on labs as we would like. I think as a group, we kind of discussed the desire to add in some more hands-on things. So there's definitely ways to supplement the curriculum that's already there. We'll talk about CERs a little bit as well, but you'll see that most of these activities are just going to be students working in groups, student doing inquiry activities, a lot of student-driven work that's going to basically lead us through these storylines. And then we'll have some sort of final assessment at the end, which we'll go again into more detail on the next couple slides. But this is how every storyline generally is laid out. We have some sort of opening event, something that we're going to kind of start by asking some questions, which will then drive our activities that students are going to be completing together as well as in groups. And then we'll end with some sort of assessment. You're muted.
I know. Thank you. I was still just go ahead and talk. So as Laurel said, one of the first things that we start off every unit with is a phenomena. So you've probably heard that term if you've attended any sort of NGSS training or PD, or if you've attended Paul Anderson. I went ahead and linked his list, or his Wonder of Science, and there's also another list of phenomena as well. The list of phenomena is a Google Doc, so you should be able to pull from it. But the real point that we want to go ahead and with a phenomena is to make it an anchoring point. It's something we'll always reference back to. As the storyline progresses, we tend to get away from it, but it's always there. And it really shifts their learning from learning about a topic to actually, figuring out why something happens. It's not there to give the kids the information. It's not force feeding it to them. It's really about them going, okay, I'm watching this happening. Why is it happening? How is it happening? And then we can go ahead and get into our QFT, where they go ahead and start designing solutions. Laurel, could you click on the list of phenomena real quick for me, please? Thank you. So this is a master list that has been pushed out. It's like 100 pages long. I don't suggest printing it. It is organized by different grades and by different standards. If you, on the left-hand side, you open up your table of contents, you can scroll all the way down to what you need. We started implementing some phenomena in QFT. Laura will talk about QFT in just a minute, into our physical science for the physics unit, just because they were a little bit more familiar with high school and routines and things like that. And physics is a little bit more hands-on. So this document we actually used a lot to go ahead and pull off of like the physical science standards to pull those. If you click on any of the life science ones too, they have a list of, so a link or a video or anything like that. There's also other ideas as well. It does have the MLS standards tied to it. So if you're concerned if it, will match what you're trying to get the kids to start questioning about, it's there. It's really, really helpful. And Wonder of Science, I feel like most people have, but if you haven't, ventured onto Paul Anderson's site, I strongly suggest you take some time at some point to go ahead and do that. He does a great job.
So like I mentioned, most of our phenomenon happen to be videos. Typically we'll watch those several times with students. I think a lot of us kind of start by just showing the phenomena video without really any kind of precursors, just, watch this, see what you observe. They're not really writing anything down. But we do then have them probably go through it a second time. And our goal here is to get them to formulate question formulation technique, formulate questions, which for some students is actually a really difficult thing to do. This is one of the SEPs that Jessica mentioned earlier, is the ability to be able to ask questions. It is a skill that they actually get assessed on in NGSS with 3-dimensional learning. And it seems like an easy thing. Students ask questions all the time, but getting them to confidently ask questions that are relevant and actually drive their learning is a little bit more difficult for some students than I anticipated originally. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about this whole presentation, but if you want something to be able to show your students to explain what QFT is to them, it seems silly to have to go through a process to be able to get students to ask questions, but we kind of set up this QFT to be able to allow for a safe space for students to be able to ask questions, to kind of force them to ask questions sometimes, because a lot of them kind of just come back with like, what am I supposed to ask about? I can't think of even one question. So at the beginning of the year, it does take a little bit of motivation for some of those students to be able to like creatively think and critically think and be able to ask questions. So really the process of QFT is just coming up with some questions of your own, potentially improving those depending on what style of question you're asking, and then prioritizing them, saying which ones do you think are the most important, which ones are you most interested in, which ones really are the ones that you want to drive what our activities are going to be coming up. So there are a couple things that we just generally suggest to students based on this QFT relationship, is to ask as many questions as you can. Just getting one down on the paper doesn't really push your limits in your ability to be able to ask questions. So asking as many as you can, as often as you can. You're not stopping to try to answer them. If someone else does know the answer to your question, we're not going to go over those right now. We're really just focusing on that process of asking questions and getting those questions down. Writing down every question exactly as it was stated, rather than like revising it, or like if someone is recording and another student is asking the questions, we don't want that recorder to be editing those questions at all. We really just want to get them down in their original format. And then we have the ability to go ahead and edit them after that. So one thing, a lot of times students do come up with just general statements, which aren't actually questions. And a lot of times you can adjust that slightly to turn it into a question. So when we write down all of our questions, we kind of focus on this general format. And then the one bit of editing that we do with students is if they have closed-ended questions that are a little bit more simple, yes or no answers, or maybe one single word, we try to get them to adjust them slightly to become an open-ended question. Instead of asking like, what is that, asking like, why or how is that happening? It allows us to dig in a little bit deeper and be able to, really investigate that question in a bit more detail. So students are I think they do a great job with identifying closed versus open. I do think these suggested words here, instead of using like is or what kind of question, I think depending on how you ask it, why and how really is what we end up using most of the time to determine our lessons coming up after that. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about QFT in general, there's actually a great book here called Make Just One Change. It's all about QFT. If you're feeling like a little bit unsure of how to really go through that process, it's just a great resource to be able to learn a little bit more about that QFT procedure and how to support students in their ability to ask questions, Some of the things that I learned from it that I didn't really think about much before, if a student does provide a question, you don't respond with something like good question. You want it to be really just open-ended. You don't want to say good question to one kid and then another kid doesn't feel like, you know, they got a great response from you. So just saying thank you and just recording and just moving on. It's really this process of just like getting as many questions from students as possible and not really identifying or claiming that one is better than the other. Just a way to get students to hopefully be a little bit more comfortable with just asking as many questions as possible. One of the other things that we get out of these storylines that was new to us when we started, I think students are doing this kind of thing often, but the claims, evidence, reasoning aspect of storyline is something that I definitely still need work with. It's something that I don't feel like I'm really great at assessing. I know that students all the time are making claims, but being able to really find the evidence that they can use to support their claims and then explaining it in a way in the reasoning section, I think it's something that I am going to be working on for a very long time still. So I'm sure most people are generally familiar with the CER format, but this is, again, just a really brief overview if you need something to present to students. The claim that they're coming up with is usually just a single sentence kind of summary of whatever the driving question is. So the examples here, do lobsters feel pain and therefore is it cruel to boil them to death? So this is the driving question that we would provide to students. They're going to come up with a claim, which is their answer to that question. They're going to find some evidence to support that. And then the reasoning section really connects it to those cross-cutting concepts and gets students to be able to explain the scientific reasoning behind why they're making that claim. There are two different examples here that you can show to students. And the interesting thing about this is that the claims are actually different. One of them says lobsters do feel pain, and the other example says that lobsters don't. And both of those are totally valid answers, and the claim isn't necessarily going to be right or wrong, as long as they're using evidence that they've been able to find to support that. So I think this is a good example to show that there's not always one right answer, but using your evidence properly and using that to support your claim is really the process that we're trying to get through here. So we go through CERs several times in every single storyline. Some of them are really short and maybe just require a couple of sentences. Others are maybe after 2 weeks worth of activities, and there are lots of different pieces of evidence that we want to include, and it might be more of like a paragraph description instead of just a couple of sentences. I've included here just some examples of different CER formats. It's mentioned all the time as a CER, where you make a claim, you have evidence, and then you have your reasoning after that. So this general format is what you see often, and there's lots of different variations in how this might look. These are just some examples from the curriculum. So you can see here, there's a claim spot, they include their evidence, and then they explain it in the reasoning. But what often happens is that students make a claim, and then they're like trying to find evidence that supports that, when really a lot of times what we want students to be doing is to gather all of their evidence first and make their claim after that. So in this case, having it in an ECR format, where students are finding the evidence first and then coming to a conclusion based on that evidence, is a format that we started using a little bit more often towards the end of the year, where we found that students were oftentimes kind of just like forcing evidence to support their claim rather than using the evidence properly to come up with a conclusion that made sense based on what they're seeing in their evidence. Jessica mentioned all those CCCs and having students identify those directly. So in some of the formats you might see in ECR here, you can see they have the evidence first and the claim below. They've also added this additional section here where your students can actually identify what cross-cutting concept they're most likely using. Typically, as Jessica mentioned, just finding like one or two. I'm sure you can find some that have like 4 or 5 cross-cutting concepts that might be relevant, but finding those kind of like overarching ideas. What are the main points that we're trying to make here? And it's those cross-cutting concepts that really are going to be what's using in their reasoning section. The students are supposed to be using those overarching science concepts to be able to explain it in the reasoning section. So having them identify it here helps them hopefully fill out the reasoning section in a little bit more detail. One other format that we have used in the past is actually providing them with the claim and having them work backwards, because we mentioned before that the questioning portion is an SEP that they're assessed on. If you give them a claim, they should be able to also work backwards and come up with the driving question that might be asked in order to come up with that claim. Again, these are after activities that we've already done in class, so they would already have the background knowledge about nitrogen and proteins. We would have already done the activities that provide all the evidence for them. But this is certainly something you could practice. If you just give students a random claim, they should be able to work backwards and kind of find a general driving question that might be relevant to that.
With the CERs, we tend to, that's usually just not a one day. If it's a really lengthy one, if it's a shorter one, we tend to just, you have a class hour, get it done. But more often than not, we'll give the kids a list of certain activities that they should be referencing to go ahead and create that, so they can go ahead and pull them up on their Google Drive, or if we gave them a paper copy of like a data set or certain activities, they can go ahead and have that in front of them. But that comes down to the kids are doing a lot. I feel with the storyline switch focus, the kids are doing much more and doing a lot more. So I feel like if you started grading everything, you'd be swamped. You really need to be selective with what you do take for a grade in a grade book. A lot of the times you're just asking for the kids to look for patterns. And so you can go ahead and assess them on a class conversation or do a discussion board or a Jamboard or a Padlet, things like that, and do it as a ticket to leave. And so there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. There are some assignments that are much longer. And I'm going to be honest, some of them I will, like the longer ones, I don't grade all of it. I'll look for specific questions or certain components of that assignment that address that overarching theme that we mentioned on the big calendar at the beginning. To make sure that they're understanding the correct answer and the logic and the knowledge behind answering that question, not like what, in what year did this spike? I'm not looking for that. I don't care that you know that exact year. I'm looking that you understand why there was a spike in something and understanding those things. And so the CERs are a big component. Our department developed the CER to get this rubric together. It was definitely a labor of love. Shout out to Sam Whitmore. I know she's listening. And so she was the one who drove the organization of this. So the CER has 3 components to it: making a claim, finding evidence, and the reasoning. So we broke each one of those down into a 5-point scale in terms of mastery. At the beginning, I feel like we're like, yeah, they really get it. We really get it. And then as they go along the year and you're like, they're still turning in the same quality of work, but we start grading them harder. And so even though they'll still be turning in the same quality of work as the year goes on, their score tends to go down. Certain aspects of CERs can be tricky for certain kids. And so having this rubric also really gives you a great idea of where, okay, they're really good at making a claim, but finding the evidence or writing the reasoning behind it is not as strong. And so it gives you a great idea of where they are in this process. I will say that we did put it into Canvas as a grading rubric. So it makes them turning in their CERs so much easier. Instead of you having one of those or printing out a million of them and turning them back to the kids. If you want to do that, you can. It just made it for us a lot easier on our grading process to just be able to select where they are on that scale for a CER as we were going through. Some of these, if you are looking at the evidence portion on this, sorry, I'm zooming in on my screen a little bit more. I suggest becoming really familiar with the different descriptors for each one. I found that this is the evidence and the reasoning was probably where the kids missed the most points because they weren't really making the connections or they weren't putting reliable evidence in there. They're saying the sky is blue. Okay, well, that's not really that's like an observation. That's probably like a 1 or a 2, depending on how they wanted to expand on that. More often than not, it is quantitative numbers versus qualitative numbers that you'll find in the evidence. Every once in a while, you will look for qualitative, but more often than not, it's quantitative evidence that we're looking for. And the kids are like, I'm just going to put all of the data in there. Well, no, we don't want all of the data in there. We want the data and the evidence that's supporting your claim. So if we're looking at the amount of CO2 and sunlight, and they're going to want to go ahead and put in oxygen, well, Yeah, it all depends on what their reasoning is for it. So it could, you know, evidence provided in there may not be explicitly listed for their claim, but the reasoning is where it ties it all together. And so we're looking at an increase or decrease in the amount of CO2 as compared to the amount of oxygen. Okay, that's great. You didn't mention oxygen in your claim. So let's circle back. How could we go ahead and evaluate our claim to make it more sense, to make more sense? So I think as the year went on, we started focusing more on making sure that their scientific vocabulary was explicitly listed there in terms of making sure they understood concepts. I'm going to say the science practices rubric, that other link, is something we recently found. And now that Jessica's back and she can be our resident guru on CCCs and SEPs, I'm really excited that she's back because I know I need to do a better job of that. And so I'm going to be running across the hall. Jessica, did I do this right? We're a fan of rubrics, and this is also another one that was pushed out by Illinois Storyline Working Group. It's been a work in progress, and we've found multiple drafts of it, and this looks like it's the most recent draft. So it has each one of the practices, the SEPs listed along the side, and then it has where you can go ahead and evaluate the student, beginning, approaching, proficient, and advanced. It's important to remember that I don't even think you could list one activity grading where it would have all these SEPs listed. You would only be focusing on a couple, so your rubric wouldn't be completely marked up. We have not figured out how to put this into Canvas yet, so I can't say it's there, but we'll figure out something. But we are really looking forward to being able to incorporate this rubric. I don't know if we will tweak it to our own needs, but we thought we should share it with you because, you know, sharing is caring, and, you know, no one wants to reinvent the wheel. So we're excited about this one.
One of the things I think Jessica and I struggled with most the first year was the assessment portion of the storylines. You know, the students are doing all this great work, and then at the end of the unit, like, how do you really assess on a three-dimensional level what students are able to show you or be able to explain to you? One of the other things from Paul Anderson that I have used in the past is his 3D assessment tool. If you have an assessment already created, you can use his assessment tools to really see if yours is three-dimensional. And I would venture to say, if you're like me, most of them are probably just one-dimensional, maybe 2 dimensions, but getting all 3 dimensions onto an assessment is really difficult. So he's got a bunch of examples here. You can screen your own assessments that you already have. But really, for me, it was most helpful to see some examples of assessments that are 3-dimensional. And luckily, the curriculum for the storylines already includes assessments for you. So if you're really struggling with that portion of it, you're able to use the provided assessments and be able to use that 3-dimensional assessment tool for your work specifically. So here's an example. This is one of those ones that we do not want you to be sharing with students. This is an actual assessment from the storylines. And I just wanted to show you that this one's already been highlighted for you. You can see the red are the DCIs. Those are basically our learning standards. We have the science and engineering practices and the cross-cutting concepts. And you can see throughout the test that all 3 of those colors are highlighted throughout. Oftentimes, the students are asked to use evidence, they're asked to make a claim, they're asked to explain something scientifically, and you can see that it's not just a memorization multiple choice test. Students are having to use all 3 dimensions to be able to answer these questions. A lot of times what that means is students are maybe provided some sort of diagram or some sort of graph, and they're able to interpret it. Our students really complained, like, we never even learned about this, but it's really getting them to use those science and engineering practices and being able to interpret and being able to support using evidence. And they're really being assessed in a different way than they have been in the past. Actually, I was gone and I had a substitute one day, and my substitute teacher actually gave out the test as a homework assignment because it doesn't really look like a traditional test. It looks like essentially a worksheet that students have seen before. It's not going to be the same kind of format that they're probably used to. So it does take a little bit of time, I think, for them to really understand what they're being assessed on. And as Jessica mentioned, like actually going through and explicitly teaching those SEPs and CCCs does make it easier for them to understand why they're being asked a particular type of question on a test. So this is just a great example. I do think it's nice to have someone already provide you with the 3 dimensions already included on a test. It does take a lot of time to grade. It's a lot more difficult to grade than a multiple choice test. And a lot of them, we did end up cutting down a little bit. Some of the tests were like 4 days long. So you have some freedom there to be able to adjust them to your needs. We actually did throw in some multiple choice questions this year because there are still some multiple choice style questions on the EOC. I think it is still good to kind of focus on those DCIs individually, but making sure that all 3 dimensions show up on that assessment is really important. We mentioned those CERs, we do use them often. A lot of times they do end up kind of being a final like summary after several days worth of activities. So it's a really good spot for like a little quiz. Can students actually, you know, summarize and use evidence to explain what we've been doing for the last 2 weeks. So there's lots of ways to have like little quizzes and assessments throughout rather than just waiting for that final assessment.
There's a couple of questions or comments over in the chat. And I guess has put those assessments in Galileo. I don't know. We're not frequent Galileo users over here at South, and we're
Yes,
so I haven't checked that out. We have put a lot of the assessments onto Canvas, just for quick and easy grading things, just to cut down on the amount of grading. Traditionally, like Laurel said, the tests can be over like 3 or 4 days. In terms of we'll go ahead and hand out data sets to students, certain students, and then they'll have to go ahead and actually collaborate on one of those test days to go ahead and pull out the information and then bring it back to answer the questions the next day. This last year, we didn't do that just because of COVID and the amount of interaction and contact tracing. And then Tracy says, what do you do for modifying that type of assessment for specific students? Tracy, I think you're talking about in terms of making multiple versions, or are you talking about, sorry, I can't unmute you. I wish I could. Or if you're like in terms of levels, like for CT versus honors or versus accelerated pre-AP. I don't know if that's what you're talking about. We didn't really make versions. That was one of the nice things about Canvas is we could do the question randomizer, so they didn't always have it open. We've had EL students in the past, so having it in a Google Doc and using that translate button worked great. Yes, the CT students who would need a CT type of class. That's what I'm talking about next. But for the CT kids, I more often than not would, depending on their accommodations, if the rest of my kids were taking it on Canvas and if they needed to go to a separate setting, I would give my my co-teacher the paper copies when they would take them into a separate setting, so they could give them 1 page at a time. That seemed to help. And we'll talk about this now. My CT kids highlighted the heck out of these tests or any sort of assignment, very similar to what Laurel showed on the assessment for having the DCI and the CCC and the SEP. So in a CT class, we're gonna start talking about how do we differentiate. I'll talk about CTs, Laurel will talk about the accelerated next, because there are extra standards and topics that they have to go ahead and cover in accelerated. So CT, I would always model the first step anytime we would do something together. In a general class, more often than not, you're like, this is the problem, and ask the kids to go ahead and design a solution. But instead of putting the kids by themselves or in small groups to go ahead and design, we would design a solution together as a whole class. So I would either have it on my dot cam or project it out from my computer, and we would talk back and forth like, okay, well, what suggestions do you have? What suggestions don't you have? Does that work? Does that not work? And so us doing it together as a class was kind of a confidence booster for them. Once they've seen how to do it once, they can go ahead and have something to compare for the remaining assignment. We highlighted all sorts of stuff or underlined the kids. We would go ahead and highlight key scientific vocabulary because that was really important for them. Knowing that key vocabulary, I would go ahead and put it into a Quizlet that was available for all of my all of the kids that are in my CT classes at the end of the class day. I didn't really want them knowing ahead of time. I still wanted to keep that critical thinking component available to them, but I would go ahead and push it out into our modules on Canvas, and I would actually send it out to case managers as well, so that way they could be working with the students during support. Key evidence was also another really big portion of it. So looking at increases, looking at decreases, looking at when it ever had like a big concept, we would go ahead and highlight it or underline it just to really bring back their focus to what are they asking here? What should I be doing? So understanding the SEPs, like, am I going to go ahead and graph something? Am I going to go ahead and calculate something? Having those up, like Jessica, I have mine above my whiteboard, so that way the kids see it and they can go ahead and be like, okay, that's what I'm doing. And so reinforcing those concepts was really, really helpful for them. Pushing out vocabulary review at the end, always great. Quizlet, they loved it. And so they would always, most of them would download it on their phone, regardless if they had accommodations or not, and would go back through and check it. But again, I would always do it after we've had that, okay, what do you think that means? And so if there was a vocabulary word that was a little tricky for them, we'd have a class discussion about it. Okay, look at our roots, look at, our prefixes and suffixes. What can we take away from this word? At the end of each storyline, before we would go ahead and give a summative assessment, our general biology and our CT biology would go ahead and push out a review guide, a list of questions, things that the students should be studying. We didn't offer it for extra credit. We had a different form of extra credit. If you're curious on that, you can go ahead and message us. But the review guide was just going over big concepts, big themes, main vocabulary from the whole storyline. And in general, we didn't really, go over it together in a class. It was more like, hey, here's your studying guide, here's your study tool, go ahead and use it. In CT, I would block off a whole day and I would project it, and we would go ahead and I would type and scribe, and the kids would go ahead and answer the questions together as a group or as a whole class. And I can tell you, I think the very first time when we did Lions was the only time I really had to help them out. For the remaining, it was all them. There was always someone who had something, and the kids knew when it was review day because they would come with their Chromebooks open. They would have all of these papers spread out all over their desk because they knew that they were going to get this review guide together, and I was not going to give them the answers if they didn't. And so it was kind of a little self-accountability for them, and I would go ahead and share that with them after the class, so that way they would have it for that night to go ahead and review for studying. But they knew it was on them that if they were not thorough in what I was scribing, they didn't have the full answer. And then revisiting QFT at the end of the segments and providing written answers to the questions. So with the QFT, and if you stick around, for the second half, we'll actually show you what that looks like in class. All of those questions that the students would go ahead and write or propose based off of the phenomena, I would keep for my kids. And we would reference it back whenever one of those driving questions came to an end, and we would move on to the next portion. And we would go back and we would look at it and be like, okay, did we answer this? Did we answer this driving question? Did we not? Is that question really still even relevant now that we've carried on with the storyline? And if we did answer it, I typed into, I did a Jamboard for my kids, so it was always in their drive. And I would go ahead and type the answers into them. It was a little harder as the year went on, but the kids appreciated it because they could always reference back to it and say, okay, yeah, we did answer that question. This is how we answer it. And so just providing those extra supplements for them, I think prevented a lot of them from not shutting down. I don't know if everyone's taught a CT class before, but sometimes more often than not in those CT classes, if they struggle, they'll shut down. And so just providing them multiple ways to access that information and participate in sharing that information really, really helped their confidence and their comprehension with the material.
All right, I don't actually teach accelerated, so I certainly am not an expert on this. don't want to call Sam Whitmore out, but she did our storylines with us as well last year and was able to fit in a lot of those extra standards that need to be covered in an accelerated biology course. I listed a couple of examples here. She was able to find quite a few ways to incorporate some of the topics, like we don't calculate water potential in our general biology courses, but we do an eggshell inquiry lab that I'm sure most of you have done before. And she was able to ask the students to calculate their water potential in that situation. Because it is so cyclical, there's a lot of times where she was able to maybe remove one activity that was kind of repetitive for her students who probably are grasping the concepts a little bit easier and replace it with something that maybe takes it a step further, calculating some Hardy-Weinberg equations and things like that. So don't want to, deter anyone from using these storylines. If you do teach accelerated, it's totally a great option. And I think it'd be really cool to be able to incorporate some additional things that take it a little bit further than we do in the regular biology class. So I would highly suggest talking to your accelerated PLC if you do teach that class. I'm sure people will have some really great ideas to incorporate some different types of additional standards that we don't cover. All right, I think we're pretty much at the end here. I think this is probably the most important slide for anyone who's interested in doing some of the storyline work. If you haven't done any of it before, this page is going to be really helpful to just kind of give you an overview of what is available to you and how much support there really is in this community. I think I would never have done storylines if there wasn't already a predetermined curriculum that was just provided for us. We've been able to change it slightly, to fit our needs, but really everything you need is there for you. And the resources are incredible and there's tons of people to bounce ideas off of. So just in general, I want to go over some of the things that are here for you. And then certainly we are happy to answer any questions, but there's probably way more information here for you than what we can even offer. So this first link is just their website. Again, it's just a group of teachers specifically from Illinois. They have their own website, but the things that are most helpful, I think, are these next two. So there's a Facebook group that you can join. I think I'm able to open this here. I'm not really sure what will come up here. So you can see that it's gonna ask me to log in. There's a bunch of information here posted by the actual creators of the curriculum, as well as people just asking questions like, I did this activity, this didn't really work well, or how do you adjust this for virtual? And there's really great resources there, people joining from all over the country with some really great ideas. If you're interested in the actual curriculum, this Google Drive folder is going to be your best option. And this is just available to you. You can see it's organized by each unit. Within each unit here, this is essentially where we were getting all of our activities. So there's always going to be a calendar with the teacher narrative. It tells you step by step what you're doing each day. And all of the activities are included here for you. So you can see they're all linked to that calendar as well as in this just Google folder. There are assessments here. There are some keys available. There's some additional storylines that aren't part of like the traditional one that you can supplement or swap out if you like some ideas more than others. So really, this is where you're getting all of your curriculum from. It's available for free. Everyone has access to it. If you're interested in just doing one storyline, you can pick one of the shorter ones potentially and just implement one small portion and not have to jump fully into the entire curriculum. So that would be my suggestion, to just kind of play around with that a little bit. Specifically, if you're more interested in doing it through Canvas, if you go to Canvas Commons, you can search, and Rockwood has put every single activity onto a free Canvas page for you. Everything is linked there directly. So it's a really, really awesome resource to kind of take the awesome curriculum and just put it onto the computer for you in a way that you can just pass out to your students, essentially with no real prep work. So, and then I don't know who put this link on there, if you want to. Jessica.
Yeah, so this is the book that was are the standards, so like the theories and explanations behind next generation science standards. So this was written by the National Research Council, and I don't know if you download free PDF. I don't know if that's just a portion or if that's all of it. So I have access to the entire book through my university that I'm working with right now for my master's. So I don't know if the school library or the county library would have an access to full version for free as well. But if you're just interested on why NGSS or, more explanation on the cross-cutting concepts, SAPs, how they kind of fit into the framework, then this is a really good book. So, I mean, I haven't read every single page, but I've definitely looked at it a lot for my project that I'm doing. So just thought that that might be helpful if you're just wondering what's the big deal about NGSS. So like I said, I thought they were just kind of, oh, just another set of standards, but they really are written differently than a typical standard that we would be used, or veteran teachers would be used to. And I think that it helps make a lot of sense and gives reason to why we should be switching.
So I just want to say,
okay.
if you're not even sure how to get to this presentation, Alice did post a link to this presentation in the chat. So
I'll relink it again if you were a little late.
So you can click on that presentation. You'll have access to that. Any of the links in there. If anything doesn't work, certainly send us an email, but you can explore. This is the last slide, the additional resources slide. If you're really looking to, start exploring it a little bit more, or if you are familiar with it and just, want to dig in a little bit deeper, that Facebook group, I would highly suggest joining. And then the Google folder, that's right on my main screen in my drive, and I, go into it a million times a day. So those are my best suggestions for getting you the support you need.
If you haven't done storylines and you're a little apprehensive of joining and doing it, 2 years ago when Jessica and Laurel took the plunge and did it, and the rest of us stayed with traditional, and kind of, so we could compare. Towards the end, when we did evolution, we did a mini unit on the Spinosaurus that covered some of the earth science standards. And it's a really great one to go ahead and use if you want to get your school year rolling, but you're like, I could be interested for the following year. I know from firsthand that was one of the ones that was the very first unit that I ever implemented, and I really liked it. The kids really liked it. It was awesome, and it covered on all 4 components of evidence for evolution. So if you're curious about it but don't want to take the plunge yet, maybe in the spring, go back and try implementing that one. So we'll keep it open for a little bit longer. If anyone has any questions, that's it. And your next session starts at 10. Some of you are hanging around and going to get a taste of what it actually means to do storylines. I've taken attendance for everyone, so you all get credit if you were here. But it gives you a nice little break. Go get a stretch break, go get a snack in. As the next session starts in 25 minutes. And again, if you have any questions, that slide has all of our emails. So, or that PowerPoint, the very first slide has all of our emails. You need to go ahead and message us with any questions that you may have, but you're all good. Bonnie, Corinne, Taylor, any questions? No? Okay. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and stop recording and end. You're halfway done. You're welcome, Bonnie. Thank you. It's very weird not to be able to talk to you. Email us if you have any questions that you think of.